Welcome to Manifest Destiny, 1840 to 1859. This is Melinda Cole Klein. The years of territorial expansion, population growth, immigration, and economic prosperity that followed victory in a war against Mexico proved to be years of foreboding for the United States. Between 1845 and 1848, the U.S. increased its size by 50% through war, negotiation, and by annexing former territories to the Union. This time is characterized by the following four items. Number one, political strains that centered on the slavery debate. Number two, relations with Mexico. Number three, U.S. expansionism. And number four, growing religious and racial prejudice. During the 1840s, U.S. politics was in transition. The election of 1844 brought in an era of manifest destiny, with presidents such as President Polk by mid-decade. Northern Democrats supported westward expansion, especially when annexing Oregon and California. But in the nominations for the election for president, Democrats passed over John Tyler because they didn't trust him, and Martin Van Buren, despised by Southerners because he was opposed to the expansion of slavery in new states, if acquired from Mexico. Democrats instead nominated James K. Polk of Tennessee, a slave owner who favored westward expansion. The Whig Party, this is a northern party that stood against the expansion of slavery, nominated Henry Clay. For the short-lived Whig Party that became the Republican Party, the vote was split with another runner, James G. Birney, of the Liberal Democrat Party. This caused Clay to lose the election. By getting the electoral votes of New York State, 36, Polk won the election by 170 electoral votes versus Clay's 105. At the time, two political positions were in regards to these two parties. First, Democrats. They promoted states' rights, equal rights for citizens, and cultural and social liberty, such as the freedom to develop slavery in new states. In regards to the Whigs, these are the pre-Republicans. Whigs supported economic nationalism, such as industrial capitalism, as the nation's one economic policy. Whigs were moral, social, and political reformers, whereas Southerners liked their masculine, class-based, hierarchical society making profits using slave labor just fine. They wanted no changes to the patriarchal authority or their political motivations questioned by smaller, non-slave-owning voters, like what would happen with the emerging industrial northern states. So, this is the Whig position, that they were opposed to these type of restraints. Number three, Whigs supported individual mobility within society, whereas Southerners wanted to keep the status quo, everyone at their place. Southerners, especially Democrats, did not believe in social climbing by those that were less wealthy, that would lead to challenging the male, elite, social, economic, and political order of life, especially free blacks and working-class whites. Whereas a president like Jackson, such as in the late 1830s, was adamant about keeping women out of politics, Whig politicians by the 1840s mobilized women to speak out at conventions against immoral behavior and how to remedy a cure. While women did not serve on juries or in political office, middle-class women participated in moral reform movements and political meetings along with attending conventions. A political hot topic, America took 2 decades, this would be until 1846, and with the election of President Polk and the philosophy of manifest destiny, before challenging the claim by Mexico as rightful heir to possess Spain's former northern territories assumed by Mexico in 1821. Manifest destiny. This is an ideological concept fostered through the religious fervor of the Second Great Awakening and to help to resolve urban crowding and underemployment in Eastern American cities. This was a charged concept that had both social and political notions that promoted annexation of Western territories. It seemed to those who believed in this philosophical perspective that Western expansion was obvious and inevitable. Belief that Protestant Americans were God's new chosen people, destined to expand settlement to the Pacific. This phrase was first coined by John O'Sullivan in 1845 in the New York Morning News. This phrase, along with ideals that would develop over time, caught on quickly. By expanding west, this implied that British-Mexican contested areas of Oregon and Mexico's northwestern provinces were rightly belonged to the United States. Thus, manifest destiny encouraged expansion. Americans, rich and poor, native-born or immigrant, kept their eyes on the developing American West. The West opened wider each year, while rural areas were transformed. By the 1850s, the telegraph had reached Oregon and California. The northern boundary was negotiated in a treaty with the British for an official boundary designation at Canada. In 1818, the U.S. proposed a boundary line that should follow the 49th parallel of latitude to the coast. But this line would have robbed Great Britain of what was known as the Oregon Country, of which the Hudson Bay Company had legal property rights. The northern provinces of the very young new Republic of Mexico did not contribute to their national economy, was sparsely populated by people of Spanish origin, and under the rule of Spain until 1821, Americans were invited to live and bring their economies to this area. Thousands of Americans lived and developed the West under Spanish rule. But under Mexican law, foreigners such as the Americans were not welcome, and Mexico abolished slavery in 1826. With the withdrawal of the Spanish Empire in North America, former territories of the Spanish Main were up for grabs. It seemed only a matter of time before U.S. interests would choose to protect the U.S. economy established in what became Mexico. Alta California, colonized by the Spanish Empire from 1769. This included 21 self-supporting missions using Christianized Indian labor, and it remained a remote province. Mexican provinces in the north claimed by 1821, but not secured as property, could have as easily been claimed by the United States at the time following the collapse of Spanish colonial control by the 1810s. This area was remote. It did not contribute to Mexico's national economy. Sparsely settled by Spanish descendants with expansive land grants given to former soldiers. Mexico challenged California land grants by the 1820s. Proof was demanded to be presented to the government in Mexico City, or their property was seized. Many Spanish Mexicans lost their lands because of this mandate by Mexico. After the Mexican-American War, former Spanish land grants, if upheld in court, were recognized by the American government. However, most were sold to incoming land developers in light of court costs for decades after the war. One of the first and largest of the Spanish land grants was that belonging to Juan José Dominguez, a retired Spanish soldier. This land grant of $75,000, known as Rancho San Pedro, was re-granted by the Mexican, then American government. Once oil was discovered in the harbor by 1921, the family resisted selling to land speculators. The family head, Manuel Dominguez, allowed land leases. Thus, the family was able to keep their land and profit into modern times. The Dominguez family, along with Watson and Carson, extended family, still own real estate on the original rancho today. Eastern newspapers encourage readers in cities looking for work to go west, young man, instead of waiting for better jobs and opportunities to present themselves. This was a young people's movement. New England families would, in the thousands, head to the Great Plains, to Oregon and California by wagon train, until the first transcontinental railroad was finished by 1869. These families and individual fortune seekers left Missouri or from southern Iowa, the end of the civilized world in the minds of Americans. Their travel plans would look something like this. 1. Departed in May, traveling across the plains with oxen, pulling their load of household goods to Fort Laramie at the eastern edge of the Rocky Mountains. Number 2. It took 3 months to get this far. The remainder of the trip was to cross the mountains, but winter would be coming soon. And number 3. If they were lucky, they made it across in 3 months, reaching the Valley of Sacramento by October. Oregon was a popular destination in the 1840s for migrants interested in farming and fishing, and this was especially true for New Englanders, whereas California attracted by the 1850s most young single men looking to make money in a mining venture. Migrations into Texas, throughout the Southwest, and to Oregon moved hundreds of thousands of Americans, immigrant, former slave, and Midwest farming families far west between 1840 and 1860. Many of these people came from the latter group, the Midwest. Most came in family groups during the first wave of migration. Second wave during the 1850s was short-lived, but dominated by young men venturing to California in search of gold. Those who could not afford it to come on wagon trains with their own transportation joined as laborers, prostitutes, ranch hands, domestic servants, and/or teachers. A jumping-off point from civilization could have been Independence, Missouri, or St. Joseph, Iowa. Hired guides took wagon trains far west along Indian trails. These travelers carried personal belongings, weapons, farming tools, and food with them during the long journey. Many knew they would never return. Livestock were often tied to the wagon's rear, such as bringing along a milk cow. The major route west was the 2,000-mile Oregon Trail. It started in Independence, traversed the Rocky Mountains through the Great Pass. From this junction, pioneers could take the Northern Trail to Oregon or the southern route to the northern part of California. The Santa Fe route followed from Independence into New Mexico, and it was possible to get to California by crossing the desert near San Diego. This is through Arizona and the Imperial Valley. Unlike how Native Americans were portrayed in Hollywood films and movies, Indian attacks on wagon trains were rare. Less than 5% of migrants west experienced attacks from the 1840s to the 1860s. Instead, Native Americans provided pioneer travelers as acting as guides, especially through difficult terrain or if there was a lack of water in the region. Native Americans also provided clothing, traded horses, or traded goods for fresh food to travelers. This journey was intense. As mentioned, it took 3 months for the first leg of the trip and 3 months for the second. It started in May and needed to be concluded by the first week in October or thereabout, entering, for example, the Valley of Sacramento before the first snows of winter fell. New towns developed for and by migrants who decided not to go further. They began towns along the migrant trails such as Carson City, Prescott, and Tucson. During the 1850s, many left and headed for Oregon. The Donner Party, though not Mormon as commonly thought, did not make it across the Sierra Nevada mountains above Lake Tahoe before the first snowfall. They had left from Missouri like others before them, but became trapped due to an early snowfall north of the lake in October 1847. Nearly half of the 87 people in the group perished during the winter months, in which they had to endure camping life, living out of doors and trapped in the mountains. The war with Mexico was fought across an enormous area, as the map on this slide reveals. Soldiers and officers like Robert E. Lee and Ulysses S. Grant gained much experience in this war that would later prepare them for battles in the U.S. Civil War. The Mexican-American War, its chronology and historical background of events. I'd like you to think about the following. Texas admitted to the Union 1845. Mexico breaks off diplomatic relations with the U.S. government. John Slidell travels to Mexico to reinstate diplomatic relations, but a leak of negotiating the sale of Mexico's northern territories for $30 million sends him home. Americans vastly outnumbered Spain's descendants in the West. Americans commercial, industrial, and agricultural, while a select few re-granted families under the Mexican government retained extensive land grants, while the Mexican-Spanish elite dominated politics in a time when American occupation continued to challenge their authority. Only about 7,000 Californios had land grants by the 1840s. The Bear Flag, California Republic, declared its independence in 1846. Battles commenced after disputed boundaries resulted in armed conflict near the Rio Grande. In time, U.S. troops would take Mexico City, America would end the war, and negotiates with the new Mexican government for the purchase of Mexico's northern territories of California and New Mexico for $15 million. half of the original amount. Under the terms of the peace treaty, Mexico sells its northern territories in 1847. President Polk had it set in his mind that the Western territories would fulfill America's manifest destiny. His tactics were to intimidate Mexico's government in two ways. Number one, by sending in the military to Texas, Mexican border, between the Nueces and the Rio Grande. This was known as disputed territory. Secondly, by sending John Slidell to Mexico City, this was to encourage the government to sell its northern territories to the United States for $30 million. While these territories were of little use to Mexico, the government was not willing to let them go without a price. They would have to battle over new territorial lines if it came to it. By 1847, U.S. troops fought the Mexican army across thousands of miles, from Mexico City to California. Nearest to San Diego area is the Battle of San Pascual, near the Wild Animal Park, where Californios and American troops battled on December 6th. Because the Mexican government refused to negotiate with the U.S. President Polk, who was dead set on securing the western area of the continent under the doctrine of manifest destiny, there was a war. Eventually, by 1847, U.S. troops landed in Veracruz and marched inland to Mexico City, fighting the army of Santa Anna along the way. Once in Mexico City, U.S. troops took possession of the country. At the time, Mexico was engaged in a civil war. The revolutionary government that gained the upper hand made a deal with the United States to cede their northern provinces for $15 million. As mentioned, half of the original price offered by Congress the previous year. The treaty was signed. All Mexican citizens in residence were promised U.S. citizenship, and their property rights would remain in their possession if ownership was proved. Our county lines throughout California were drawn from the old Spanish land grant boundaries. Few changes have been made over time. In the final year of the battles with Mexico, gold was discovered in California at Sutter's Mill near Sacramento. Gold had been known to local residents, but a large strike had not been hit until early in 1848. As the story goes, after the mother lode, a large gold ore find was hit, sailors in San Francisco abandoned ship, apparently left their city jobs in droves, and local governments and newspapers had to shut down due to the lack of workers that had left for Sacramento to stake a mining claim. By the end of 1848, $6 million had been extracted from the region. Easterners saw this as a good time to head west. This was a clear sign of prosperous times ahead for Americans. 55,000 came by wagon train. By 1849, the United States was caught up in gold rush fever. The 49ers migrated to California not to start families, but to get rich quick, living on the profits of their labor. Afterwards, they would move to cities to enjoy a life of leisure and entertainment. Many Chinese came to California in search of gold too, with aims of sending money home to China. However, most miners did not hit big claims. And by the 1850s, some areas were completely played out. Smaller claims were bought up by corporate mining firms as well. This became a time in which men competed with machines. The individual miner could not compete with the mechanization of mining. Men tired of mining went on to become industrialists. One example of this is the denim jeans entrepreneur Levi Strauss. With the improvements of printing, the distribution of materials, and the success of marketing of mass cultural printing, there became a large outpouring of American literature from the 1840s. Books were many. They included household management guides to such that would include cookbooks, those on child rearing, cleanliness, personal etiquette, and hygiene, and among other books, the sentimental novel. Many of these new publications were written by women and read by women. This middle-class popular reading attacked the serious writer, and women were accused of creating a huge influx of reading material that was not worthy of printing. But sentimental novels were big sellers. They outsold, in the time of Herman Melville's Moby Dick, Nathaniel Hawthorne's Scarlet Letter, and Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass. Sentimental novels made sacred the dutiful attention given by the American Christian woman. Book heroines were often women. In these stories, women were often depicted in their daily trappings of housework, marriage, and motherhood, set against the world ruled by men. The home was often depicted as a sacred place, holding up the ideals of the cult of domesticity. All the while, American women struggled with these new roles, inner feelings, while powers to control their own destinies were clearly linked to men, and self-fulfillment at university or in a profession was not considered by society an acceptable aspiration by women of means and status at this time. In the 1840s, the slavery debate heated up. If and when territories from Mexico were to be had, should these areas allow slavery? After all, it had existed before, under the rule of Spain. Or should this type of economy be void under American policies? In August of 1846, a Pennsylvania Democrat, Congressman David Wilmot, proposed to Congress a constitutional amendment that, quote, as an express and fundamental condition of the acquisition of any territory from the Republic of Mexico, neither slavery nor indentured servitude shall ever exist in any part of said territory, end of quote. This proviso passed the House of Representatives as an amendment, but the proviso pushed the country closer to civil war. It raised questions about slaves that had not been asked previously. Southerners saw slaves as property, and since their rights to property were protected under the Constitution, they believed that they could take their slaves wherever they wished. This led to strong opposition to any attempts to bar slavery while the country was expanding. This was one main reason the proviso was never passed. The amendment was never actually adopted by Congress and was in fact expressly repudiated in the Compromise of 1850, and its content declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court in the Dred Scott case. As I have listed here, the Compromise of 1850 was a set of 5 laws, as you can see here on this slide. Primarily, it had to do with boundary lines, balancing the slave and free state political divide, while protecting property rights of Southern slaveholders as promised under the Constitution. One of the laws in this bundle was the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. This law met with serious opposition because some states recognize former runaways as state residents who possess legal rights. This would include their right to bring the runaway case to trial rather than outright turn them over to bounty hunters who had little concern or motivation for capturing correct runaways or recognizing their new state status. Because the Fourth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution offers protection of private property, Southerners demanded more effective laws and procedures for the return of their property. This resulted in the following legal actions. Special commissioners were to have joint jurisdiction, judicial power, with the U.S. Circuit and District Courts. Fugitives could not testify on their own behalf. No trial by jury was provided or would be allowed. With this law, running away became a federal offense. This allowed slave catchers to go as far north as the Canadian border to catch and return runaways. Lastly, this law stated that every citizen and U.S. resident was responsible for helping to recover, detain for removal, and return fugitive slaves. So any person could be a fugitive slave catcher. Northern abolitionists harbored runaways. A popular crossing point was the Ohio River, or making it to Pennsylvania or New England, to which people that lived there hid runaway slaves. Like with illegal laborers today, there are unscrupulous employers who are willing to hire for very low wages such workers. While not impossible to catch fugitive slaves, it got to be so difficult, expensive, and time-consuming, fugitive slave catchers ended up, in many cases, just giving up.